All right, so what we're going to be starting with today is our day one for ecology. Now, remember, ecology is going to be the study of ecosystems, and primarily what we're going to be looking at during this unit is not only what an ecosystem is, but the different parts of an ecosystem that make it up, and also how living things interact with one another and how they interact with the environment itself. And so that's kind of like just a general overview of what we'll be talking about. So today specifically, what we're going to look at is what's called known as ecological hierarchy, environmental factors, and population growth, or you could really say population changes. And this right here, and everything that we'll be talking about during this unit, we're going to always bring back to talking about those environmental factors and population changes. So on the next 4 days of this lesson, we'll be constantly reverting back to these topics and bringing them up, which is why we're going over them on the first day. So the first thing to know are the parts of an ecosystem and know the different levels that exist. So we've already actually talked about levels of organization when we talked about the cell being the smallest. And we talked about how you have the cell and tissues are made up of cells, and then tissues make up organs make up organ systems, an organ system makes up an organism. Now, in this unit, we're going to actually pick up with where the organism is. So now we have an organism, and of course, that would be an individual living being of whatever it is. Now, remember, a lot of students in this section will oftentimes think that only living organisms are basically things that can move, like animals, insects, things like that. But a lot of times that we forget about how plants are also part of that living environment too. What a population is a population is a single group of organisms living together, and it also is the same species. So it's that single group. So, like if we ask for the population of Richland, we talk about the number of people that live there, but we could also find out the population of squirrels or the population of deer, the population of pine trees, oak trees, types of grass. So that would be a population. Now, a community, again, I'm going to bring up the example from Richland in a second, is several populations of different species living in the same region and interacting together. So if we were to talk about the community of Richland, and typically whenever we talk about these hierarchy rules, we're also only really speaking of basically anything except for people because we live outside the norm on things because we have the ability to really change the ecosystem to fit our needs instead of us having to adapt to meet its needs. But a community would be all the living things inside of this area interacting together. Um, and community and ecosystem is actually a very similar concept, except for ecosystems also include the non living components. Whenever we say non living, what we mean is the things that aren't alive and never were alive, like water. How much rain does an area get? How much water is available? Um, it could also be the amount of nutrients in a soil in the soil. If it's nutrient rich soil, then that would of course help plant life grow, and that would be a plant interacting with something that's non-living like the soil, or are there a lot of worms in the soil? If there are a good bit of worms in the soil, then that's actually going to help with the nutrient richness of that. Um, the amount of sunlight an area receives, those are components that are non-living, and of course we know that we interact with those non-living things all the time. And then what a biome is a biome is an extremely large ecosystem that covers a wide area, a massive expanse, such as if we're to talk about the ecosystem of a forest, no big deal. That's usually a pretty big area, and we're going to look at all the different parts of it. But if we were to actually talk about the temperate deciduous forest of the southeast, or really in the United States, well, that's actually a biome that stretches from all of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, northern Florida, Georgia, and it actually spans. It goes all the way up into um, southern parts of Canada. And so it's a massive expanse. So that's the kind of the difference there between a biome and an ecosystem. And typically, what we look at is actual climate patterns and the type of evolutionary or adaptations that are needed to live in that type of area. Okay, but most of our stuff we're going to be looking at is individual ecosystems and how things are living and interacting with each other. So here's just kind of an image to kind of show you the breakup of that. So right here we have an individual elk, and then we move up to a population of elk, and then we get up to a community which would include the elk, the rabbit, the deer, the bushes, the looks like some type of predatorial cat, maybe like a mountain lion or something, an owl, and a moose, beaver, all that kind of stuff. And then as we move up, we actually hit an ecosystem. So now we actually have a stream and water that we're looking at. We have the sun rays that are coming down. We even have the air that the eagle is flying on itself, the nutrient richness of the soil. And then a biome. You see how this biome talks about it stretches. This would actually be the tundra that and it stretches so much of Canada and Northern America. And then we have the biosphere, which would be bio meaning living, sphere would be the earth, so it's the living components of the earth. All right. And really what I'm going to do in questions that will be around this, you won't have many questions that'll just be a basic definition. What it will be is I would give you an example, and I would ask you what's being described here or what level of organization is being described here. So usually the first thing you have to do is figure out, is there anything living or non-living being described there? If there's anything non-living being described there, you know it either has to be ecosystem or biome. If it's only living components of an ecosystem being described, then it has to be, community, population, or individual. And individual is usually pretty easy to pick out because it's only talking about one specific animal or organism. And so it's actually pretty easy to pick out. All right. So talking about the actual parts of an ecosystem. So I've been talking about how there's different parts that are considered living and non-living. What we actually call those are biotic factors and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are parts of an ecosystem that are living or they were once alive. So that could be an animal, or that could be an animal that has died and its carcass is on the ground. It doesn't really matter as long as it was living or once alive. Plants. So if we think about a tree, or even a tree that has been cut down and is laying there, it's still considered a biotic factor. The reason why I keep talking about those two factors of it is a lot of students think that, okay, well, if it's a branch on the ground, then that means it's abiotic because a branch isn't alive. But it's part of a living thing and it was once alive, so we leave it in that category as biotic. Bacteria, those are actually parts of living things, and they're very important because they're such a crucial role as being a decomposer. Again, I have a dead log there, so just talking about how things that were once alive are still living. Feeding relationships. So that would be like a predator-prey. What eats what? Are you a herbivore that eats only plants? A carnivore that eats only animals? So those type of relationships. And we also have what's known as a symbiotic relationship, and we're going to talk about those later on. Some organisms, they work together that are part of different species. They actually work together and help each other out. Some organisms, basically have a parasitic relationship, kind of like a flea or a tick. But basically, anytime you have a relationship between living things, that's still considered a biotic factor. Another common one is just competition. Competition for a food source. That is a biotic factor. Abiotic factors, these are the things that have nothing to do with living components. But due to their interaction with them, they're equally as important, such as air. It's obvious that air is important. Temperature. If it's too cold, there's certain organisms that don't live in the extreme cold, just like you don't find a polar bear in the desert for that reason. Water. Water is one of the most important things, kind of like air. Um, Rain, climate, wind, sunlight, pH, salinity. What that means is the salt content, such as the salt content in the ocean, the amount of salt that's in the water. Humidity, we know all about that being here in Mississippi because our humidity is awful. And then human impacts. We are considered an abiotic factor because we don't play by the laws of nature and the ecosystem. We through deforestation, even though yes, we are a living thing, but um, our negative impact on ecosystems is considered abiotic because those organisms have no control over that. Just like the organisms have no control over the temperature, they have no control over what we do to their habitats. So this is an example of what I might ask you to do. I might give you an image and I might just ask you, hey, what are the biotic factors in this image? And so I could have them as like a multiple select thing to where you select all the biotic factors. So in this example, students will oftentimes select only the animals here. So they'll select like the dragonfly, the fish, the raccoon in the background, the eagle, the deer, the frog, the turtles on the log. But a lot of times they'll forget about the lily pads, or they'll forget about the plants, or they'll forget about the log itself, the trees in the background, the grass, the flowers, the cattail reeds. All of those parts are biotic factors, or living components of the ecosystem. Now, if I ask you to do the abiotic factors, that would be things like the water, the amount of oxygen that's in the air. You see the light coming off of that sun. So, those would be the amount of soil, the amount of nutrients that are in the soil. The actual soil itself would be considered abiotic. So that's what you're going to have to be able to do there with that, is be able to make sure you can pick out the living versus the non-living. And don't forget, competition and the relationships between those organisms are also biotic factors. So whenever we talk about an ecosystem, we have to also talk about not only the parts of the ecosystem, the factors that exist inside of an ecosystem, whether they are living or non-living. We also have to talk about how is a population actually controlled in an ecosystem. Whenever we talk about control, we don't talk about us controlling the population, such as setting a limit on the number of deer that hunters can kill inside of a season, which technically that would be considered an abiotic factor because it has nothing to do with the deer itself. The deer didn't cause that. Um, so what we have to talk about is what limits a population. What keeps a population of deer in check, or what keeps the population of whatever the organism is in check to keep it from growing outside of the resources that are available to it. And what we call those limiting factors density dependent factors and density independent. If you notice on those two terms, I put biotic versus abiotic. The density dependent factors, what we mean by density, we mean the number of, of organisms that exist in a specific area. That's its density. And so if there are too many cows in a field, then that means that there's not enough food for them. So what would limit the growth of that herd would be dependent on the population of cows. Density independent, on the other hand, would be an abiotic factor, such as, let's say, if I had 1,000 acres and I had 100 or 200 head of cattle out there on my land, but then there's a massive drought that killed off, half of the acreage of grass. Well, that had nothing to do with the cows. The cows didn't contribute to that. They didn't. Their numbers had nothing to do with it. So it wouldn't have mattered if I only had one cow out there, or if I had, 1,000 head of cows out there. It wouldn't have mattered because they had no control over the weather. So that would be the density abiotic factors. Because an ecosystem relies on a set of complex conditions to help it succeed, like the availability of food, water, even competition, mating, and space, these factors can be biotic or abiotic. And what we mean by that is um, how density dependent, if there is too many of the organisms that are fighting over water, then in that sense, that would be a density dependent. But if the reason why they're fighting over water is because there was a massive drought, well, that would be an abiotic factor because what caused there to be this competition? That's what you have to look at is what causes there to be the competition. If it's just normal competition, just because, organisms have to compete with each other, that's where we get those terms like survival of the fittest, then that would be a biotic factor. But if there's competition due to the fact that we built a Walmart inside their habitat, and so we made their habitat, half the size or a quarter of the size, well, that would be they're competing for space, food, and water that was outside of their control. So that's whenever it becomes an independent factor. So you kind of have to look at the cause there. Typically, how I ask these questions is not only do I ask you to be able to identify what is the limiting factor here, what is actually causing the organisms um, to either reduce in their population or maybe even increase in their population. But I'm also going to ask you to be able to identify it as a density dependent and independent factor. And that's usually how those questions go. And we'll have a lot of practice on this. And that's the reason why in this unit, using the quizzes will be really important. I know they're a little bit longer than normal, but the reason why is because I'm giving you a lot of examples and just trying to make it to where you would have as much information and become as familiar as possible with this material. Density dependent is a biotic factor. This is whenever the population growth or birth rates are controlled by the density, or we could say the number of that population. Most density dependent factors are biotic, such as predation. That would be like a predator prey relationship. Basically, the more predators that exist, that means that you're going to have to have a lot more competition to be able to get to the food, and that means that some of those predators are going to have to die. But if I have a lot more prey, then that means there's plenty of animals to go around, and so actually the predators don't have to compete as much. Competition between those organisms or between inside their species, between predator versus predator, or it could be, it doesn't even have to go that far as to be a predator. It could be, how many herbivores live in an area and how much grass is available to them. And then disease. This could be a disease caused by a parasite or the size of the population. A lot of people oftentimes forget about how population size, the more organisms you have in a specific area, they can actually start to develop their own a disease. A really common one in deer is blue tongue. If the population gets too dense inside of an area, they'll actually develop a disease known as blue tongue and it'll kill them. Usually the denser, or that means the greater a population, that also means the greater the mortality rate, which basically means the greater their death rate. This creates more competition for those available resources. And whenever we say resources, what we're talking about is food, water, the ability to mate. If there's a lot of female lionesses in an area, but then of course there's only that one Mufasa style lion that's the head lion, the king of their jungle per se. Well, the reason why he became the king is there has to be a fight there, and there could be challenges made. And whoever is the victor gets to have that ability, whether it be for food, whether it be for mating. He gets to eat first. That he also gets to first pick at mates. He's the only one that actually gets to mate in a lion pride. And the same thing happens with wolves and things like that. Even with deer, and that's the reason why the biggest deer, the strongest deer with the biggest rack, the reason why they got that way is they were able to avoid getting killed, whether it be through hunting and they're going to be able to reproduce more. And so those are resources that are available. As the resources are what those organisms need in order to survive. Density independent factors are typically abiotic factors when a population size is changed due to actions outside that population's control. This could be a weather, a natural disaster, pollution, and even human impacts like deforestation outside of, pollution, of course, is also a human impact. An example of this is an individual deer may be killed in a forest fire, regardless of how many deer that happened to be in that area. Its chances of survival are the same whether the population was high or low. That's what we mean by that. If there was a lightning strike, it didn't matter if there was a lightning strike that happened to hit brush causing the fire, or if it was some campers out there that left their fire going and unattended and then it started a forest fire. So it doesn't really matter how it got started. In that sense, it's known that the deer had no control over it, and the population of the deer is probably going to change, but it's going to have nothing to do with the fact that how many deer were there. And so that would be independent of them. And then the last one that we're going to talk about is carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the size of the population that can be supported by the ecosystem. Now, whenever we talk about the size or the size of the population, what we're referring to is how much resources are available in that ecosystem to support the organisms that will live there. A great example of this is if we were to look at the difference between the desert and the rainforest. The rainforest, because it has so many more available resources, it has a lot more life than the desert. Now, the desert still has some resources, but it's not teeming with life the way that the rainforest is, and that's because of the amount of available resources. And of course, the main resource in that one being rain, which is of course going to allow for everything else to grow there. And then and of course that affects the size of the population. And then I give you the example here with a case study talking about the wolves being a natural predator of the North American deer. And I kind of give you some examples of that as well. And a further little question at the bottom there. So here are two graphs that kind of depict carrying capacity. So on the one on the left, what we see here is we have time on the x-axis and we have the population density on the y-axis. And then you see that dotted line known as K. K is the carrying capacity. That means that is the amount of resources that are available. If K were to lower, that means that there are fewer resources available. That could be space for organisms to live in safety. That could be water availability. That could be food availability. Heck, that could just be available mates that exist. Or if K was to increase, then that means there are more resources available. So what we see here is we see two different lines. We see the red line that's called exponential growth. Typically, you would expect exponential growth whenever you add a new organism to an area where there are no predators that are going to hurt it. What I mean by that are, like in Mississippi, there's a lot of hunting camps in Mississippi that bring in exotic animals because there's actually not any real predators that will that actually hunt and kill those. Yes, we have some coyotes, but most exotic animals are a lot bigger than coyotes, but they're going to go after little sickly animals. They're not going to go after a full-size deer. We don't have wolves. We don't have panthers. We have a few black bears here and there, but they're not going to be a predator of a large herbivore like that. So if we sat there and took something like that and introduced it here, the next thing you know, their population growth would be, really, really high, and we would call that exponential growth. Logistical growth is whenever population has kind of like leveled out with the carrying capacity that exists, and that's typically what you'll end up seeing there is more of a logistical growth. And things couldn't exponentially grow forever because eventually the resources are obviously in that image, the resources are below their population. And so eventually they're going to have to die off. That's the reason why I really prefer the one on the right, that image to depict what happens with populations because they don't just sit there at the carrying capacity. What they'll do is they'll actually, you'll kind of see what you see there with that red line populations, whenever they're introduced to an area, an organism's population will extend past its carrying capacity, which then starts to create competition for resources, things like that. And that would be a density dependent factor. And then, so that means that some of those organisms are going to die off and they're going to fall below carrying capacity. And then they're going to kind of go back and forth that you see there, and their population is going to kind of rise and fall. But if we look at the average there, their average is going to be right there around that carrying capacity. So it's not like things just reach carrying capacity and that's it. Nothing can really die or grow. They actually just kind of go back and forth and waffle back and forth over that line. Um, and so that's how that works there. All right. So that is it for day one. Make sure that you don't forget go over the practice inside of our quizzes, and don't forget to do your classwork assignment on this. Thanks. Bye.